Welcome to this session. We're going to be examining the theme of digitization and what it means for payment systems. So a big thank you to my guests as well who joined me today. We've got a good range of specialists to support us. I don't yet see Denis in the room, although I did see him earlier, but that might be my side, so I'm going to kick off. So a big thanks to Herman. I think a lot of what he talked about this morning resonates with what I'm seeing from the perspective of the work I've been doing at the Banking Association on payments modernization. So I think for me, what I've picked up is a useful framework to look at digitization in general and for payments as well. And that is to look at kind of 4 quadrants of how digitization plays out. So they are technology, law, markets, and social norms. And Herman put up a very similar picture, actually. He talked about desirable, which was people, viable, which is business, and feasible, which is technology. So I think I would just add the legal, which is the law and the enabling environment. So I really like that framework because it talks about not just the technology and how we embrace technology in digitization, but about the people, the impact on the people, the contribution that people make to it. And I think one important element in it's trust, and I think Herman touched on that as well. It talks about how we create trust in a digital environment. When we're not seeing other people, we don't have that ability to sort of use judgment in terms of the people we're engaging with because we're engaging digitally. And the way we build trust into our system is a hugely important factor. I also like Herman talked about the role of the consumer. And we know that that's such a critical part. The way in which we test whether the solutions we build are going to resonate with the markets that we're building them for, be it business, government, or people, is extremely important. And I think the way in which we establish whether those solutions we're building are working is important, and it requires a greater degree of agility in our system and how we build systems. I think also when we look at digitization, we recognize it happens in different sectors. So there's a level of government digitizing itself to enhance the way in which it does service delivery to citizens and to businesses. It's about digitization of business. It's digitizing existing industries, but also how new industries are being created by digital technologies. And then digitization of people. So I think a big component is digital literacy. So how individuals understand the way in which they're going to be engaging with business and government and one another through digital platforms. The hardware that's in the hands of the individual, so the access to smartphones, for example, is a key component, and then also access to data, the cost of data, the extent of our digital networks in South Africa to offer digital access to even remote and rural people as well is important. So we want to talk to you today really across kind of 4 themes to think about as we talk about digitization. So one of them is the national imperative that is digitization. So as the globe digitizes, we know that, stronger, more richer nations are accelerating digitization. They're building huge global platforms that are influencing local countries. But I think also to note that Eastern countries in particular have very coordinated digital strategies for their own economic growth, and they're recognizing certain pillars to deliver that. So I think digitization is a national imperative for South Africa. We want to understand our contribution to digitizing our economy and specifically our role within providing digital payments in support of those strategies. We want to think about as well as we talk about digitization, the importance of digital solutions enhancing lives. Ultimately, digitization needs to make our lives better. And we want that to be a focus and a key priority for us as we think about digitizing and creating digital platforms. The other is about not leaving anyone behind. So we've talked about financial inclusion in the past. We need to be thinking about digital exclusion, how we bring all of our citizens on the journey, how we use it to enhance small business growth, employment, and so on. And then lastly, what can go wrong? And for me, we think about enhancing lives, but there's a lot of downside to change, and we need to be very deliberate how we think about the things that can go wrong in digital systems. And I think we all have a sense of that, but we must be very deliberate how we plan for that and how we think about that and how we build those controls into our digital systems proactively. So I'm going to start off with really talking about the national imperative. And what I found quite useful is looking at certain Eastern countries like Thailand, Singapore, India. They've been very specific about the pillars that support digitization, and they've been very intentional about making sure those pillars are in place. So digital identity supports your ability to identify yourself when interacting digitally. You need digital infrastructure, you need data networks, you need speed and cost of data to be supporting. There's discussions on national cloud infrastructure to support cloud in your own jurisdiction. The need for national data standards, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but the ability to ensure that you can speak to one another digitally through a language that is common to the parties in your digital environment is through data standards. Digital literacy just means that people understand how to use technology, how to ensure that it works for them and doesn't put them at risk. Skilled manpower, that's a big one for South Africa. The ability to harness our talent, to retain talent, both in terms of how we bring digital solutions, but also in terms of how we build the protections into our system. I read out of interest, India had identified in its strategy it was going to need about 1 million cybersecurity experts. So that's 1 in 1,000 people need to be cybersecurity experts in a digital economy. Digital payments is an enabling factor. That's where we come in. So we're looking in terms of our contribution to the national digital imperative. But also recognizing as we put in our digital strategies that these other pillars are ones on which we may have dependencies in order to deliver our digital strategies. Hardware I've mentioned, so smartphones in particular. And then I just picked up recently social scoring. So I talked about trust and creating trust in this kind of environment where you can't see your counterparty. So we understand, you know, the notion of there's cyber criminals out there, and sometimes you don't know exactly who you're dealing with. But there's also an element, particularly in China, starting to talk about social scoring. And if you look up, that's a very interesting topic where you might get they will score you for anything that you might, you know, if you drop litter or you play music on the train or you don't sort your recycling, it decreases your social score. That may be something that sort of starts to elevate in a digital society where your trustedness might be impacted by sort of behaviors that can be tracked through data. It's just a kind of emerging theme that I thought was interesting. So I think then just to talk across the different sectors. So Herman did mention his experience of trying to renew his driver's license. A lot of people going through it at the moment, but I think the point is the imperative for government to digitize in terms of enhancing the way in which services are delivered to customers. There's a role that we can support that. Invariably, digital transactions do have a payments element to them. So I think for us, it's understanding how we integrate our payment solutions into these digital platforms, be they government solutions, be they business solutions, and Herman made reference to that as well, being payments, not being the product, but he called it a feature. And I think also an enabler of digital transactions for the South African economy. In terms of business, I think Herman gave very good descriptions. I'd also echo, you know, the way in which platforms are connecting producers and consumers, even in the financial sector. You're getting sort of disintermediation, you're getting, you know, fintechs bringing together borrowers and lenders and so on. I really liked his emphasis on the consumer and the fact that consumers are also producers. These are all things that we need to think about as we think about modern payments infrastructure and modern payments networks, because the supply chain is absolutely changing, and I liked Herman's reference to that. It brings us sort of into this discussion around banks and non-banks. So where traditionally banks have been very involved, we've had the critical infrastructures, Swift are here with us today, Visa, MasterCard. So we've had that kind of traditional supply chain. Now that is arguably going to change because of technology, because of changes in law and our regulatory environment. It's going to change because the sectors that we serve require us to change. So we have to understand the way that the technologies support that. My contention is this: I would say, in as much as we are in a journey to understand how to bring non-banks into our system and how to allow them to bring their innovation, their technology, their specialization into the national payment system to allow it to be world-class. our focus collectively as South Africans needs to be, how do we make South African payment systems world-class, not only to ensure that we have South African systems serving the South African economy, but also to create capabilities that we may be able to export. So how do we develop world-class solutions, knowing that our fintechs, which include our banks, are also looking to be globally relevant and bringing solutions. Now, we can do that better if we collaborate. So I loved Herman's analogy about the people side and the emphasis on collaboration, because in as much as we do have skills and skill shortages, capacity constraints, we do have a lot of knowledge across our payment system. They're all in this virtual room with us today. And so I loved the emphasis on the collaborative elements. I've got Herman's picture in my mind where the fish come together and shape themselves in the form of a shark. And we effectively have to become that South African payment shark, which we do when we can collaborate. So I want to talk a little bit about data. I mentioned that data is essentially the language that we use when we speak within digital systems. So we know that we're on a journey as a sector to upgrade our payments message standards to an ISO 2 standard, ISO 20022. So Denis will give us some insights into the potential of that journey. So we're coming from really some quite antiquated, very limited sort of short message standards in our payment sector, but really the reality for us is almost to say, as we embrace a richer data standard for us to talk to each other as payment service providers, we also need to understand that our payment systems are serving the broader economy. Now, those data standards that our clients are using, the different sectors we serve, government, individuals, and the services they use, they're also using data as a language. So we probably need to think a bit broader than beyond how we speak to ourselves in data and how this richer data standard supports that, but also to understand how payments data can integrate into the way or the things that our different sectors transact. So for example, if we can integrate tax codes or VAT codes into our payment systems, does it help our businesses to do their VAT recons? If we can include something like a serial number, if I go and buy a fridge and my payment's got the serial number, maybe one day when I want to claim the warranty, I just go back to my bank and check when I made the payment, and there's all the information. The point is, let's think broadly and strategically around the language of data and the way that payment sits as an enabler to support the broader economic activity that happens to conclude or start with the payment. I think the other thing I just wanted to emphasize then, on top of data, is obviously the analytics. So I like the term smart systems. So as we start understanding the power of analytics, how we build that into our payment systems, we create smart systems, we support good decisioning in payment systems. The obvious one for me is how we prevent fraud, how we support anti-money laundering, etc. But obviously there's a whole host of potential client value propositions you can create when you use smart analytics to create intelligent payment systems that then support uses of our payment systems. The last one I really just want to touch on is APIs. So APIs really take us into a new environment where to create payment systems, we typically had these closed networks, and we would come in, those of us who were in the network would talk on secure channels, exchange messages, but APIs really allow us to break that wide open. It allows us to bring permission parties into a network to bring these specialist activities and effectively give effect to that new supply chain that Herman was mentioning. The piece of work that gets very interesting, and Denis maybe can help us because Swift has put out some good papers on this. As we think about creating our data standards and as we're building for ISO 2 capabilities, we're also going to be looking at API standards and the way in which APIs support this broader ecosystem, this richer participation in a new kind of network. So how do we think about the interplay between data standards and API standards? And I think that's a new discussion. But for me, one of our two biggest work items as a payments community to deliver on this technological digitization promise is how we collaborate to define those data standards, the language with which we want to speak to one another and with the clients who use payment systems, but also then the standards with which we support interoperability of a broader network of individuals or individual firms and entities to deliver a richer, more agile, more innovative supply chain in the delivery of payment services. So that's kind of my take from where we are today. I said I would touch on 4 points. So the first was really the national imperative. The second really is speaking about bringing everyone on the journey. So we will talk a little bit about our communities who typically prefer cash. What will it take for us really to support them in bringing relevant digital solutions to them? We'll also talk about what can go wrong. So, I think in the digital environment, things are changing. We get new risks coming up or old risks reappearing in new ways. We're getting new types of risks because of the way we're combining new activities like big data with financial services. And then I think lastly, the focus on enhancing lives. So let's be clear about maybe to go Herman's analogy of the people side. We are all competitors. We all bring in the things we want to deliver as entities when we come together, but we have a potential to focus our agenda around bringing better payment solutions together, acknowledging our codependencies on one another, and also with a focus on how we enhance lives for the citizens within our country who consume our services and consume the broader services in our economy for which payment systems are enablers. So on that note, Pieter, I'm going to come to you first. So your business, RealPay, supports businesses in South Africa and in the broader region. Can you give us a bit of a take on what you're seeing in terms of how your business's needs are evolving? And maybe just think a little bit about what you see as some of the capabilities that our national payment system needs to develop in order to meet the needs of the business sector.
Thank you, Megan. Wonderful morning. The summer is really upon us, and it's good to see all the colleagues, and the payments ecosystem very well represented, in terms of the people attending as well. So wonderful to see everyone, and to everyone for making the time this morning. Megan, valid points that you've raised with us, also the keynote address by Herman. So from our perspective, we just need to remain aware of the evolution that we are currently part of. Many a time one would like to say, things need to happen faster. Are we doing things fast enough? It's good to continuously raise the bar. But what is important is if we reflect back, and like you've asked, in terms of our business, in the past decade and a half, 2 decades, way back, we were a very limited number of non-bank participants or payment service providers in the ecosystem, that participated, that contributed, and that landscape totally evolved into a current landscape where that's part of the value proposition. Yes, you will always have the fintechs that are fast and agile, addressing a particular niche in a very good way. But we need to make sure that, in terms of what we bring to the table, that we also are quite aware of the common objective, around payments. And in terms of the technologies and services that we bring, that those are also aligned with the goals and objectives, of that common purpose or common vision. So from our perspective, an aspect that really guides us in our business is that of the vision of the different countries within which we operate. We are very much aware of that, and we contribute to that. I think most regulators in the room will bear testimony to the input either of our business or the associations that we represent. It's very important for that voice also to be heard, when we craft regulations, policy and legislation. So that opportunity, from my perspective and from an African continent perspective, that's a major strength that we have, the ability to participate, when it comes to crafting, policy, rules, regulations. It might sound simple, but in many territories, it's not that easy in terms of contributing. And part of the contribution very much is about removing impediments ultimately to increase trade, economic activity in the country, and lastly, the velocity of money, the turnover of payments and or money in the ecosystem. Thanks, Megan. For now, I'm going to perhaps break there and allow the other colleagues as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Pieter. So Denis, can we come to you? I mean, you're a key account manager for Sub-Saharan Africa for SWIFT, with the long history with SWIFT, and I think must be, you've got a good insight into what's happening globally, and then the role of entities like SWIFT to support change. Even though the path taken by different countries varies, some of the goals remain the same. And the benefit of an entity like SWIFT, not just in terms of the infrastructure you give, but perhaps also in terms of the global standards you give us to support things like cross-border trade. But what's your take on what must be done to modernize payment systems in South Africa and the region? And do you see a difference between South Africa and the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa?
Thanks, Megan. No, I think most of the continent is experiencing the same, are facing the same question they need to answer. How do we get banking or payments? I mean, we're focusing on payments, but generally banking out to the wider population. And obviously, we've seen successes. In my view, and a lot of these successes are like siloed successes in specific areas. So to summarize, and Pieter's already touched on some of these things, I mean, I see 4 areas where the challenges are and we need to get it right, because I come back to the basic statement is that the technology is there. So our keynote speaker said the technology is there. It's about people and do we want to do it? And obviously people are driven by many factors. Banks are driven. They need to provide obviously riches to their shareholders. You have regulators that need to ensure that payments are exchanged securely, etc. Data is not compromised. So basically, I see 4 areas in the region. So regulators, regulators have a key role to play. They need to create an open and competitive market, which allows other players to compete on a level playing field. So, and a level playing field is both ways. So you have fintechs coming into the system. They don't have the same checks and balances as the very large institutions that have been around for many years. So the regulator needs to find a way how to bring in new fintechs, as well as ensuring that they don't, push aside the current incumbents in terms of cross-border payments. As an example, in South Africa, the National Payment System Act of, I think, 1998 is currently under review. And one of those things is how do we open the payment, the payment system to the fintechs that traditionally would have to go through another bank. Can they now obviously access the system directly and provide more opportunity and more options to the end consumer? Because at the end of the day, it's about the end consumer. Interoperability, and so this is one of the key drivers for the Vision 2025 goal of the South African Reserve Bank. We need to look at how payment systems interrupt, between each other. So, SWIFT is one of them, but we have multiple. So how do we get these to work or to talk to each other? And that comes down to obviously standards, ISO 28222 standards. It comes to APIs, so SWIFT, which is known for managing standards. I think we also need obviously a body or somebody to put their hand up to say how do we govern standards, API standards. So whilst there has been innovation in digital payments, it's often siloed. So that's my point I raised earlier. So we need to see how we can stop stifling of innovation because it's just happening in certain areas, and what is learned in one area, how can it flood into another area? And as our opening speaker said, I mean, payment is not something you wake up and do, and it's part of a bigger process. The payment is at the end, and we need to make it part of the customer's journey. I mean, obviously, infrastructure is critical, which I've touched on, and then which was related to interoperability. I mean, infrastructures, they need to be able to, talk to each other. So what has been done in the region. I know the African Association of Central Bankers, obviously you have the SADCs, and you have the other payment regions that are looking now. We've done this in our region. How do we get it out to being able to pass on this across the continent, and then obviously outside of the continent? And then lastly is the customer needs and financial education. So if I just focus on the customer needs, as is already said in the keynote speaker and Pieter has touched on, we need to understand there's a customer at the end of the day. It's, banks don't just talk to banks, or fintechs talk to fintechs. There's a customer that wants to talk to another customer, or a corporate that wants to talk to another corporate. And it needs to be more than just payments. So we're just talking about payments here, but it's also about lending and insurance, et cetera, et cetera. How do we get that into the greater community? I know you said 3 minutes. So lastly, obviously financial education, South Africa. I mean, this is where I'm born, and we know that the payments infrastructure probably serves 5 or 10 or maybe 20% of the vast majority. So how do we get people to say that cash is not, I only have money if it's cash. If it's digital and it's in an account, it's just as good as having cash. So, and I think, Megan, I'll end over there.
Thanks, Denis. Pieter, I'm going to come back to you quickly. What's your sense of where the critical areas of collaboration are for us? And you've used a term before, the middle core. So what's your sense of what that looks like?
Megan, my sense is that competition in the payments industries across Africa are intensifying dramatically. There are many, many more participants coming to the fore, and that changes the dynamics. But to my mind, and in terms of our business, RealPay, and our experience, it's in the interest of the greater good to have more competitors and more options around the table. So that aspect around collaboration, ensuring that we have a legislative environment that is enabling of innovation, that allows new innovation in, and for participants in the process, potentially also to work together, to bring the new innovations, to the table. To my mind, that's critical. We always need to remember that both the consumer and the businesses in particular that we serve have evolved as well, and they're also adopting digital in their general walks of life, not only in payments. And we need to respond swiftly, as an industry, to those needs and demands, both at business and consumer level. And in order to do that, it is a cooperative type of approach, allowing for competition. I'll perhaps end off in saying that my sense is that the industries are healthy. We've got more and more participants at more levels in the NPS. It's reflecting the levels of competition, increased competition, and it's also allowing, that innovation to the benefit not only of the business and or the consumer, but society at large. And let's not ignore the role that the regulators are playing to enable that. It is a critical role, for all of us. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Pieter. So, Jerome, you're an entrepreneur. You've been the business that's needed payment services in your previous career, but now you're in a payments fintech. Tell us how you see the payment system evolving, and what are the important enabling factors for our national payment system to evolve? Jerome, I think you might be on mute.
I was indeed. Yeah. Thanks for having me. There's a bit of an echo, by the way. I know that's, yeah. I can hear myself talking, but hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to start by addressing the SWIFT issue. Not trying to put Denis on the spot, but I think if you look at the way payments have been done internationally cross-border, today we are able to take a camera and we can send a picture or a message or an email all over the world in seconds. Yet I can't go to my bank on a Sunday. Yet I can't make an international payment that settles within seconds. If I want to send 1,000 euros from my bank, standard bank, to my bank in France at BNP Paribas, it will cost me hundreds of rands of fees. It will take 2 to 3 days at least for the funds to actually clear. Now, I know Swift is actually working on some pretty exciting technologies on cross-border, which would instantly clear in 24/7. And blockchain and cryptocurrencies will actually enable that. There are actually solutions out there already, like Ripple, we're based in San Francisco, and the cryptocurrency called XRP, which ultimately eliminates the whole cross-border issues and the need of having nostro accounts or trillions of dollars literally locked in the system, the passive, doing nothing. So I think that this is some of the illustrations of how things are going to be changing in the future, and this is pretty exciting. In my mind, there are two other ways. Now, look at the technology evolves and the way behaviors change. If you look at the technologies of tap and pay and the rise of QR codes, these are technologies that have been around for a while, but the pandemic has certainly accelerated their adoption. So the use of tap and pay and QR codes, they're becoming more relevant because now in a pandemic world where contactless payments becoming the new expectations. Evolution, to your question, Megan, also means addressing financial literacy. And I think the way things are going to be addressed in that vein is simply by the virtue of the solutions that are offered to the consumers in ways where people won't even have to think about how to use new payment methods because the experience will be so intuitive and so simple to use, which is why I like the premises of RPP, because it removes the barriers of people having to understand how people can understand the system. They would need to know their ID or their phone numbers or whatever the case may be, and that's pretty much it. So looking forward, I think we can imagine the way these technologies are part of our day-to-day lives. Biometric will play a more pivotal role. I mean, I just got this new surface at work, and I can log in just using my eye contact. And this is where the ways payments will actually be made. So futuristic payment methods, we can call them that way, they're on the horizon. And the good thing is South Africa, amongst other African countries, are ideally positioned to leapfrog directly into these new technologies, bypassing the need of adapting cards. We do not have historic banking systems that could prove to be a barrier for adoption of these emerging payment solutions. So last but not least, Megan, you asked, what are the key enabling factors? For me, it's simple. In no particular order, it must be mobile first. It must be data free. And last but not least, it must be very simple and extremely intuitive for the man on the street. Yeah. We need to ensure that fintech companies that develop such groundbreaking solutions are working in an environment that is conducive to entrepreneurship, fostering innovation. And I think this talks about government policies, regulations that encourage collaboration and dialogue between all factors in the space. I'm new to the payment industry. I come from a travel tech background. And in the last 8 months, I've already seen some of the friction, reluctant sometimes to even have a dialogue between the incumbents and the disruptors. These are dialogues that we should be having. This is not a case of who is disrupting who. This should be a case of who is going to be partnering with whom and how quickly can we foster the dialogue.
Yeah. Thanks, Jerome. Those are some great insights. I'm going to come back to some of those just now. Ain, lots of talk about regulators, but I'm not going to ask you about regulation because you're now in the SARB's FinTech unit as part of the Intergovernmental FinTech Working Group. So my question to you is really, what is your take in terms of what's most important to keep South Africa's payment system world-class? Either from a technology perspective or in terms of how you see it through the lens of a regulator and enabling adoption of technology in our national payment system.
Thank you, Megan, and good morning to everybody. From my perspective, I think, and I think Jerome gave a nice segue into where I want to go with this question. I think that collaboration is the new competition, and that is fundamental because the sources and the nature of the tensions have changed. It's no longer about bank versus non-bank. Instead, it's become about centralization versus decentralization and how those two worlds eventually melt together or the one beats the other. And as a consequence of that, I think that the payment system needs to start viewing themselves as one collaborative body, right? Because fintech and these innovations that sit outside of the formal sector are consequences of the inadequacies that the current payment system and the way that it currently works. It's a consequence of that. So once we can start accepting that my competition may be the best person for me to collaborate with, and that the more people we have in the room, the better, I think then we are moving in the right direction. And we need more of those conversations, and we need more systems thinking perspectives that come in that have the ability to trickle through and have an understanding and grasp of the very things that payment systems underpin. And then I really also have, cliches to offer at this point. So I agree with the idea of a level playing field for participants, that it needs to be fair, it needs to be risk-based. Also important is customer-centric models. And I often hear the conversation center around consumer education. And I don't dispute that there are parts of this of South Africa where consumer education is lacking, but I would like to offer the perspective that says, can we consider that there are people who understand payment systems, banking, etc., financial services, have had a look at it and go, this doesn't serve me? And that maybe that is the perspective that we need to have, that we need to assume when we talk about customer-centric models and approaches, right? That says, I'm going to meet you where you are. And it's the one thing that I've enjoyed about fintech in my time with deep diving into some of these innovations, is that it's not concerned about, the complex payment, how complex payment systems and banking is. It is primarily concerned about how do I get this consumer the utility that they require in a way that is efficient, that is cost effective, and that addresses their needs directly. And it doesn't endeavor to change that person's behavior. It meets them where they are. So I would like to offer those two perspectives. Also, when we talk about being world-class, I think a thing that we need, an element that we need to put on the table is socially responsible innovation. And I can go on for days about this. But in a country like South Africa, where we have so many socio-economic issues, it is imperative that innovation, especially within payment systems, that a lot of people can argue is a utility, that in payment systems, we must endeavor to, at the very least, not exacerbate socio-economic problems. And when it's optimally functioning, that we address them directly. And the only way we do that is if we are intentional. And if it's never going to be a nice byproduct of innovating for bottom lines and for efficiencies that are internal to our companies, it's only going to happen when we become intentional. And for me, that is what we need to remain world-class. We can't ignore those. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Anne. Some brilliant insights. I love how you talked about delivering the right product to the right person in the right way. Doesn't require financial education. And it speaks to Jerome's point about being intuitive. If you can just figure out how to work, you don't need that educational piece. So it's the point is, and I think it speaks to that socially responsible element. If you have the intent around solving a customer problem, there's less challenge around the financial education part. Jerome, I'm going to come back to you. Tell us how you at Ozow are seeing barriers to adoption of digital versus cash. And tell us a little bit about what Ozow is doing in that space.
Thanks, thanks, Megan. We talk about all of these new emerging solutions. We talked about QR code, we talked about e-wallet, Apple Pay, which has made groundbreaking progress in the last 12 months. So we like to talk about the behavioral shifts, but the reality is that most of these payments are often those that actually can afford doing them in the first place. Right? So I think there's a bit of a reality check that we must do, and I would like to use this platform to actually start doing that now. We have 7 out of 8 people in this country that have a bank account, which is pretty impressive. We only have 1 out of 8 South Africans that have access to a credit card. So most of the barriers that have prevented greater participation ultimately come down to lack of access to infrastructure, high data cost, a general mistrust in financial institutions. I think we're all familiar of the scenes on a Friday where people queue up at the cash machine to withdraw their hard-earned cash and taking it out of the bank account because they're probably afraid that their balance is going to be eaten up by the fees or the debit orders before they even get a chance to spend it. So we end up in a situation where still today, cash remains king. Informal traders do not have access to a device that allows them to take card payment. Some of these devices can cost between 500 Rand to 1,000 Rand. And yet informal traders make almost 20% of our GDP. So let's not forget about data costs, which is another barrier to entry. So this is where I think Ozow is making some groundbreaking changes. We're really focusing on the consumer needs, and we're trying to drive this financial inclusion for millions, because ultimately the solution that we have, our instant EFT, tackles two things, or marries two things rather. The fact that people have a bank account and the fact that they have a phone. We have over 80% smartphone penetration in this country, and that's all you need to essentially participate and to pay using Ozow. We also cover the data cost via reverse SMS billing. So this is actually an ideal way for them to transact in a digital world in ways that simply was not available to them before. And of course, for the merchants that apply the solutions, they're going to be benefiting because they get access to an additional distribution of consumers that was not available to them before. And of course, we like to compete on fees.
Thanks, Jerome. So I think it's important to acknowledge that in digitizing small businesses, we help them grow, we help create employment, and part of their digitization journey in increasing markets, access to markets, as you've said, even globally, to create cross-border markets for themselves, they need to have digital payments mechanisms that their customers can use. So I think that's got to be a very big focus for our sector. And absolutely, we've seen a big role for fintechs in bringing down the cost of acceptance, card acceptance in that community, which I think is very positive. I'm going to jump quickly to cross-border payments. Denis, back to you. What's your view? So, I mean, there's been a lot of emphasis by international standard setters on trying to bring down the cost, the speed of cross-border payments, compliance, etc. Can you just give us a few thoughts around how you and Swift are seeing how that can change, and I guess also to help open up markets for South African businesses?
Well, so I think Jerome gave an example of the worst case scenario when it comes to cross-border payment, and something we would have all experienced if we were in banking for the last 10, 15 years. About 5 years ago, Swift recognized the need to start building, well, let's just say its members, which are, commercial banks, said that they needed to start building payment services which kind of looked similar to, the fintechs today, so in terms of, just being an app, being immediate, knowing what the transaction is, etc., where it is, the DHL of payments. Mm-hmm. So Swift, put together in response to its corporates looking for faster, transparent, and traceable payments. They put together an API. It is an API called Swift GPI. So today, Swift GPI ensures cross-border payments are fast, many in seconds, traceable across multiple banks in real time, and which delivers confirmation at the end of the day. So ultimately, when the beneficiary receives the funds, the person that's sending the funds knows it has been paid into the account, not just from bank to bank. Ultimately, the beneficiary receives it. Now, I know we don't have much time to go, but today, over 1,400 member banks send more than 300 billion daily on Swift GPI, and 40% of those payments are credited to the beneficiary's account in less than 5 minutes. Okay, so this is what happens when you have a solution, an API, and at the same time, the corporates, which are the customer at the end of the day, can track this themselves. They know where the payment is. There's no need for them to phone the bank or the bank to provide them with an update. They know real time where their payment is at the end of the day. So, and what this has done is obviously, if you know where the payment is, there's no, so where the costs are, so just to summarize, in the middle, the payment cost of a let's just say Swift message is something like 4 euro cents a payment. Where the costs are on the edges. So if a payment goes wrong, what does the bank have to do? And that normally involves manual processes to fund the payment. So what Swift GPI does for a bank is they know where the payment is. If they need to change the details of that payment on the fly, this can be done on Swift GPI. they know what the corporate knows what the costs are of this payment in real time. So if you're as an individual sending a student in the US $1,000 and only 950 gets there, you want to know who took the $50 as an example. And this is what Swift GPI does. So, and then over and above this, I mean, we have other services which are built on this. So this is a platform that Swift is working on. So by 2025, we have a Swift transaction management platform. There's going to be pre-validation and many other services around that. And maybe my last comment on that is that, your financial crime and compliance, which obviously banks are faced with, and it costs them money and time and effort, which they ultimately have to pass on to their customers. We are going to mutualize that at the center so that each of these institutions don't have to go out and get the software themselves, which costs them money. So ultimately, all these savings that are passed to the commercial bank will then be passed on, obviously, to the end customer, making it a much more friendlier and happier experience doing business with its bank and making a payment.
Thanks for that, Denis. I love the DHL of payments, and I guess the transparency, because even our domestic systems are not. Yeah, thanks for that, Denis. I love that analogy. And I'm going to give you the last word. What do you worry about? What can go wrong as we move from cash to digital or into more integrated systems? How we use data, more analytics. What are the things that we need to be thinking about proactively to prevent those bad outcomes that can come from a more digital environment and more digital payments?
Thank you, Megan. I can muse lyrically for a while about this, but I think I'm going to keep it brief. I think I'm going to go back to my point around socially responsible innovation, that we target and we focus on socio-economic impacts of the innovations that we continue to create, and that we endeavor to make sure that those attempt and successfully do so and address those socio-economic needs, right? And a lot of the times when I have this conversation with people, they don't quite understand what I mean by that, but a really good example is AI. AI currently is being used to automate existing processes. And these processes for many of our participants are 70 years old, they're inherently biased, and simply taking that and automating it serves nobody, right? And that's what I mean about being intentional so that we avoid some of these mishaps. I also think that sources like non-traditional data are really important for countries like ourselves. We have a lively informal economy. We have informal settlements. So a lot of the times things like proof of addresses and proof of income become a moot point. So again, let's use the technologies that are currently at our disposal and do so in a socially responsible manner and endeavor to address directly the needs of our consumers. That is how we mitigate against things going wrong. And also, we're not fortune tellers. We're not going to be able to know everything that's going to go wrong. But if at the very least we all take on that perspective and we all endeavor to innovate like that, I think we will be ready for whatever challenges arise later on.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm very grateful to our panel. You've brought lots of different perspectives, and I get the sense we have a lot in common in terms of the objectives we'd like to see. I think we've got a rich community of specialists to contribute to the way in which we achieve and reach our goals as a country and maybe a broader region as well. So I look forward to the rest of the conference. I look forward to next year, hopefully, when we can see you in person and have a cup of coffee and lunch and a glass of wine at the end of the day to try and to tease out these ideas and meet Herman's vision of getting the people part right. So thank you very much to everybody and for those of you who've joined our session. Thanks.